All right, good morning, class. Well, I guess this would be at night when you're watching this video, but I just want to say good morning as I'm doing this video this Tuesday and to be in placement of our class session because I will be out of town for the rest of the day. But if you have any questions on any of the topics so far, feel free to ask me in lab or to send me an email at fosterti@uwstout.edu, or you can give me a call at 715-450-6165 as well. And we do take text to that number if you have any questions about the material. Otherwise, I'll plan on talking to you on Thursday about a little bit more of human sexual development across the lifespan is what we're going to be focusing more on. So just a couple housekeeping pieces. I'm going through and grading your discussion boards, and they are all looking very good so far. And then also we have your assignment coming up that is going to be due this Sunday for your case vignettes. So you can go ahead and look at the assignment descriptions. They should be all posted in Canvas as well if you wanted to go in there and look at the rubrics and what will be being graded. And then also kind of look at the description. Should be a good guide. But if you have any questions, let me know. All my assignments I give are going to be very open-ended, so they're going to be very loose, so you can have a lot of creativity in there as well. But there are a few core concepts that I will be looking at as I grade, and those are going to be available in the assignment descriptions. So we'll go ahead and we'll start doing our lecture today for you to watch. This will probably take about a half hour, so it's not going to take terribly long, like a full 2-hour class time. But please take with you what you hear today in our lecture and then put that into your curiosity, into your questioning as you're reading your textbooks as well. So go ahead and continue to read the required text readings. And once again, all of your supplemental text readings are optional, but highly, highly encouraged for you to really get the most out of this class. So without further ado, we'll jump right on into week 2 of our sexuality class. And so with this is going to be more of a podcast type, a little bit more audio that's going to take place of our lecture. So I'm going to try to be really, really clear as you're listening to the audio of our lecture today. And once again, if you have any questions, I'm always there to kind of walk you through the actual PowerPoint on Thursday, and I'll also post the PowerPoint slides, at least some of the content, in online too later on today, or excuse me, probably tomorrow. So week 2 is going to be about sexual development. So this is going to be more about like the sexual organs, sexual development of genitalia. It's also going to be more about a little bit more about the sexual development of gender as we move on, but there's going to be a little bit more of a focus on that as we dive into more of the sexuality and sexual orientation is going to be talking more about the gender and orientation aspect. So today is going to be more about the development of sexuality throughout the lifespan. So we'll start with our why is sexual development really important for us to study? Well, it's because sexuality evolves over time. It shapes our biology, it shapes our psychology, and it shapes our relationships significantly. So majority of our sexual development is not just in one area. It comes through many different levels of our life. It comes through, what we call maybe basic models. It comes through models that are very systemic. One model that I'm thinking of right now is Bronfenbrenner. If you haven't heard of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, I actually kind of think Bronfenbrenner's ecological model demonstrates sexual development significantly because it shows different areas and different tiers of his circle that could very well impact an individual's life. But let's face it, sexuality is part of life. So that is just one example that you might want to consider when you're looking at sexual development, is that's not just one area. There's multiple phases, there's multiple tiers to sexual development. Kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There are needs that are below that are more stable, and then as we get higher up the triangle, that's more self-actualization. I like to think of sexuality development the same way. And understanding human sexuality is really a developmental process. It's not just a one and done. I know there's a lot of models out there that try to say that this is where and when sexuality develops, or when our genitalia develops, which is true. We kind of see when that develops in the womb, but we now know that sexuality goes well, well beyond just those timelines. So I want you to really think about that as you're focusing more on these styles of sexual development. And some key theories to really think about, though, I talked about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, but there are three key theories that I really want to have you focus on and maybe kind of sit with what really resonates with you. If you kind of remember from last week, I kind of talked about there were different theoretical frameworks for sexual development, such as CBT, behavioral, psychodynamic. But there's also some key theories I want to have you focus on. Those would be Freud's psychosocial stages of sexual development, Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, the lifespan development theory by Carroll, the biopsychosocial model, and then attachment theory is really, really important to kind of look at. So I'll repeat those again for you. Freud's psychosexual stages of development, Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, which really focuses on identity and intimacy, the lifespan development model by Carroll, the biopsychosocial model, and also the attachment theory are significant factors that play into sexual development. So I'll talk a little bit about Freud's psychosexual development. So Freud was very focused more on the relationship as a young child and how we can get repressed or stuck with sexual desires, often with the opposite partner of the same sex. Once again, this will be all clearly defined in your textbooks, but I'll give you the highlights that I know of. So that could lead to an Oedipus complex, where maybe a boy may be jealous of dad because he is sexually attracted to his mother. There would be the Electra complex, which is the vice versa for a woman, where they might be more sexually driven for their father. This is outdated. This is historical foundation, usually, of sexual development. And I think it's pretty well known that these psychosexual stages are not going to be the end all be all, and we've all accepted that it's just more the basis of psychosexual development. I actually find Erik Erikson's stages are really, really relevant, though. So we'll move on from Freud's, and we'll move a little bit more extensively into Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages, because that focuses not just on sexuality, but more on identity and intimacy. And I like the word intimacy more because intimacy gets into how we relate with friends and family and with partners in our intimate relationships. He indicates that there are 8 psychosocial stages of development. And in those 8 psychosocial stages of development, we're going through what we call different psychosocial crises or tasks that an individual needs to solve or complete. And there's 8 stages of them. So I highly encourage you to really Google what are the 8 stages of Erikson's psychosocial development. I know the first one is trust versus mistrust. And that is something to really consider when you are sitting with clients, is that a lot of times if someone has had this psychosocial crisis that hasn't been solved in their life, you can tell that they may have not had a very good upbringing because they don't trust anybody. And according to Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages, that would mean that that person got stuck at a very young age of learning to mistrust rather than learning to trust people. And there's research that shows that happens even in the womb. As a child is learning how to trust their parents. Is their parent smoking or drinking alcohol? Is their parent eating the right foods? There's some saying that that can even change your biology of us not being able to trust our parent. Or maybe later on, if we were born into a world and we were getting neglected, we are now learning to mistrust people. So it happens from day one of conception, in my opinion. And a lot of research is kind of seeing that as the more prenatal mental health. So I highly encourage you to look up Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages and see which of the psychosocial crises do you think are impacting an individual's sexual development or intimacy, excuse me. That's more the intimacy focused and identity, but those two really do focus on sexuality development as well. And then we also have the lifespan development model, which you'll find in your books. I believe it's the Carroll book, and then also the biopsychosocial model, which is pretty straightforward, that biology impacts our psychology, which impacts our social interactions. And then highly encourage you to look at attachment theory and sexuality. So those are kind of the 3 focus I want to have you delve into a little bit more. Freud's psychosexual stages, you can kind of look at that as more of a historical foundation. Erikson's psychosocial stages, which I really think is really important for identity and intimacy. There's lifespan development theory, there's biopsychosocial, and then attachment theory. So really highly recommend looking at those this week, especially as you're doing your case vignette. You can use some of these theories to really help you create a nice solid case vignette for yourself. But we'll start a little bit about how does sexuality develop in your body from infancy and early childhood, and we'll go throughout different stages of our life right now. So, like I kind of said earlier, sexuality is a very basic development according to early research, but it is a lot more complex than just these phases. But it is important from a counselor perspective to look at it from more of a basic or stage model and to have a bit of a basis so you can work with when you are working with maybe sexual dysfunction or maybe even looking at intimacy dysfunctions. These stages can really help you understand things very much so from a trauma lens too. I'm primarily a trauma therapist, so when I look at these different stages, my brain is what has happened during those times that has maybe impacted that development of sexuality. So as you're going through your vignettes this week, think of that. Also, as you're listening to this lecture, think of that as well too. So let's go ahead and get started. So we got infancy and early childhood. So when a child is born in their infancy, there's a lot of exploration of their body. There's a lot of curiosity about their gender, which I think is really healthy. So that's why you might see a little child who might be playing with their penis or they might be playing with their vagina because they're exploring their body. There really is no sexual intent. It's just this foundational anatomy part of their development. They're getting to know who they are. That does get complex, when we throw in other aspects of gender or non binary, which we'll talk about in a later week. But for now, when a child is younger, they are really focused on exploration. And then that's where caregivers really is really important for sexuality, is modeling good sexual behavior, modeling appropriate sexual behavior, modeling curiosity can really help a child as they're exploring their body and their curiosity and their gender in early years. So really, it is important to be aware of messages that child is receiving. Even when they're exploring themselves or exploring their genitalia, it's really common for a parent to maybe provide shame and say, "Don't stop doing that. That's not appropriate." When really, in that stage, it is clinically very appropriate for them to continue to start looking at things. And parent psychoeducation in infancy is probably the number one thing for that child, is to really teach a child that it's okay for their child to kind of look at themselves or to play with themselves. It might look like masturbation, but once again, it's not sexually driven, it's curiosity driven. And then as we slide on into childhood, so infancy is usually about from birth up until about age 5. But then we move into childhood development, which is preteen, and that's going to be age 6 to 12. And this is where the child is starting to really understand more of a concrete development of their gender and then what their roles are. So they're probably starting to find out, who are their friends. Do I connect with women? Do I connect with other girls? Do I only want to hang out with boys? This might be the time where kids are starting to look at if there are cooties around. I don't know if they still do that. But when I was younger, they were talking about how girls had cooties and boys had cooties. And that was kind of this idea that things were not, that they did not want to hang out with the other sex. But early exposure to that can be really, really, really important, of letting the child know that they can be friends with anybody. So once again, it goes back to that parent psychoeducation. And early exposure to media, can really give a lot of misinformation too. So just know that as a therapist, look at the child's age when you're considering their sexuality. And then at ages 6 to 12, the child still is thinking in more concrete terms, so they're not able to understand or to discern information that's in the media or from parents. They just biologically can't, because our brain is not fully developed to do that until we're about 12 years old. Maybe at the tail end of this phase we are able to, but prior to that, it's all very, very concrete. Yes, no, this is what you're supposed to do, and a child really struggles with that. So as a clinician, you really want to focus on normalizing that curiosity, fostering safe boundaries for a child, even if they're 6, using anatomically correct terms to talk about their body, and then work with the caregivers to address any of their own discomforts or fears about talking about sexuality. Because if the child picks up on uncomfortability about sexuality or hypersexuality, then the child's view of sexuality is developing significantly different. So that's something very important to focus on as a clinician. And then as we move into adolescence, I want you to think more about how puberty is kicking in. So puberty is bringing along a bunch of hormonal changes and secondary sex characteristics as well. So your whole body's releasing a lot of new things. This is going to be from age 12 to 17. So that's, you probably all have gone through something like this because we're human, through different puberty and hormonal changes, and it's a very, very scary, difficult time, and it's the first time we start to really feel a sense of sexual attraction and identity formation beyond just the black and white. This is more of the abstract sexual attraction, the abstract identity formation. They start exploring their relationships. They might start dating. They might even start exploring with sexual activity or orientation, or the concept of consent is starting to come into their minds. So this is a very important phase for teaching your clients about their sexual development. And then as a clinician, I'm always trying to give you little clinical notes. We want to address body image, sexual identity, and consent education within therapy if we can. We really want people to start normalizing these discussions, talking about risky behaviors, talking about healthy sex behaviors, because we know now that the whole abstinence approach does not go very well for training people to not be sexual. We're sexual beings. The kids are going to be sexual. They're growing into this. Or hormones are not controllable. Therefore, we need to address it from more of a behavioral aspect. And also during this time, now that it's in 2025, we also want to start supporting the conversations of LGBTQIA plus community and the identity development there. That is something always important to consider nowadays in our mental health field, even though I know there are political things that are occurring right now that are making that a bit more challenging. According to the ACA and to our competencies of advocacy, we really do need to start talking about the reality of what's going on in our world, especially from a sexual perspective. And LGBTQIA plus, non-binary aspects, these children are able to abstractly think about it, and I think they're actually doing a much better job of managing the abstract nature of sexuality than any other generation that is older than them. So it's kind of neat to see that as a therapist. And then as we move into adulthood, age 18 to 25, this is where we're focusing more on that sexual identity and relational intimacy. This is where Erik Erikson's theory really comes into play, is about right the adulthood phase, because we're looking more at what am I going to do with my life, who am I as a sexual being, who am I as a partner, as a lover, as a husband, as a wife, who am I as part of this polyamorous relationship. You're going through all these questions, and according to Erik Erikson's model, you'll see that there are aspects where we can really develop a lot of shame for even thinking that, or we can develop a lot of autonomy. That is actually a couple phases in there. If you look at it, is that there's shame versus doubt, which is something we've come to learn. Are we gonna or shame and doubt versus autonomy? Are we gonna take autonomy, or are we gonna go with shame versus doubt? Are we going to be shameful for exploring these thoughts, or are we going to feel more autonomous? That's something that's really important to consider when you're considering adulthood and Erik Erikson's model. So I highly recommend looking at Erik Erikson's model when you are talking about emerging adulthood, because it's more about identity. And as a clinician, just when you're focusing on an emerging adulthood about sexuality, focus on values, expectations, their goals they have for their relationships. Support their sexual agency and their emotional capacity and safety to have these conversations. And then also address any shame, trauma, and relationship patterns. This is an area where you really want to look at the client's history, because there could be patterns of unhealthy relationships and they don't know what a healthy relationship is. There could be a pattern of a lot of shame and also possible sexual trauma that has completely shaped their view of relationships or sexual development. And then we slide into just adulthood, so mid adulthood, 25 to 65. And this is where we really are kind of solidifying our sexuality. It's you see it more in kind of this more solidified nature, but it's also continuing to be shaped by relationships and parenting a little bit. But usually at about age 25, we're starting to kind of move on into our own living quarters, into our own careers. And this goes on for another 40 years, so we're probably not going to be viewing our parents the same when we're in our 40s, 50s, and 60s. So this is where sexuality really starts to take shape. You start to see it being ingrained in your life for better or for worse, because there can be challenges with things that we've done. If we haven't processed things prior to our adulthood, Now we're seeing this become the norm, become the expectation. And this is where I believe you start to see intergenerational trauma happen. It's when we start to see sexuality shape and take hold into someone's belief systems and into their values and into their lives. But unfortunately, if they have children, they have unprocessed trauma or unprocessed aspects of sexuality development, then that can be passed on to other generations as well. So, in your position as a clinician, what I would want to do is shift your focus more towards addressing any mismatches in a client's desire for sex, and then relational dynamics, and then also life transitions. So I'll say that again. You want to shift your mentality at this point when a person is in the adulthood range to look for, is there a mismatch in their desire, their relational dynamics, and their life transitions. Could sex be used as a coping strategy? Could trauma be coming up? Is this desire for sex, or is this to feel important or self-worth? This is where those questions about sexuality become really, really important. And you're starting to challenge maybe some unhealthy sexual patterns that this person may not even know, or does know but is scared to admit it, that are present in their life. So we're really looking at that integrated systemic approach here. That's where maybe the biopsychosocial model might come into hand as well as a clinician. And then as we move into older adulthood, 65 plus, sexual activity often continues but changes to be more physiological. I've actually took a class back in undergrad, and they brought in a group of different couples, and they were talking about their sex lives. And the older the couple was, they reported better sexual intimacy. They reported connecting more if their relationship was longer term. So it goes to show that sex does improve with age. Even human sexuality does improve. So as a clinician, what you want to do in this phase is you want to normalize that sex does get better. You want to normalize the importance of sex at an older age. You want to address any possible medical conditions, grief, or identity shifts that happen that could be impacting sexual functioning. And you want to advocate for advocate against ageist assumptions. You don't want to assume that because they're old, they're not having sex. In fact, actually, if you talk to a lot of older couples, they are still having sex, and apparently it is a lot better than it is when you're younger, even because you just have more of that intimate development, the identity development, and your sexual development is fully in place. And critical considerations to consider at all times when you're focusing more on sexual development as a clinician, and if you're helping somebody, once again, sexuality is not just about gender or sexual orientation. It's about sexual dysfunction. It could be about how sex is part of trauma. There's a lot of different avenues you could go with this, but our main focus on critical considerations for sexual development is to really focus on the developmental context that they're in and focus on how does that shape their meaning of sexual concerns. So once again, developmental context and how does that shape the meaning of their sexual concerns. And also assess where you can for what stage they are in their own sexual development, identity development, their ecological development, such as Bronfenbrenner's, which would be more ecological. Identity would be more Erik Erikson's development, and then also physical would be more of that, looking at what stage are they in, possibly according to Freud's, but also I would say more just you're looking at the body, where are they at, and that's kind of what we talked about a lot today. Avoid any pathologizing terms or words or even biases that could come out unconsciously. Look for your countertransference. Make sure we're not making faces that are going to maybe possibly put the person at an unease. And I still remember one day I was talking to an individual about something uncomfortable, and I ended up kind of taking a deep breath because he was talking for probably about 30 minutes and talking really fast, and I just kind of let him go. And then at the end, I was like, just took a deep breath, and he just goes, well, great, now I'm going to beat myself up about that sigh. And then we talked about why he immediately went to that, because it really was just trying to gather information. But what that ends up saying to the person was that I was overwhelmed. And we talked about it, and we were able to salvage it. But this goes to show how the little microaggressions on our faces, in our body, really can say a lot. And then also think about how a lot of people have sexual trauma. They're getting all those microaggressions from everyone all the time, possibly, especially with sexual orientation or sexual identity or gender identity and gender orientation. gender curiosity. Think about how many times they're getting those microaggressions every day from people. It is very disheartening. So as a clinician, you really want to consider that. So avoid the pathologizing terms. I'll watch your microaggressions and countertransference, but also stay culturally and developmentally attuned. Keep looking for where they're at in their culture, but also in their developmental stages. And we want to make sure that they are in the, if they aren't, we want to bring up the idea that they may not be in the correct developmental stage for sexuality. And if they are, maybe it's something you just let them know that you think they're actually right on the same path, and it's very helpful. So we're going to wind up a little bit for today and just kind of have you think about that. So just as a quick run through of what we talked about before we close, we talked about human sexuality and how it is developed over more of a phasic model, different stages. We talked about some of the historical foundations of sexual development through Freud's psychosexual stages. I encouraged Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages to be further explored because I find that is an area really important, not just in sexual development, but also identity and intimacy. Look at lifespan development theory, the biopsychosocial model, and of course, attachment theory always has implications for sexuality. We talked about infancy, early childhood. We talked about childhood development, adolescence development, emerging adulthood, and then late adulthood. And then also about clinical considerations, making sure that we focus on the context and the meaning of the sexual concerns, focused on just exploring the current stage as part of your assessment and past experiences, avoid pathologizing language, and stay culturally and developmentally attuned. So as you're using all this information, use it to help you with your case vignette discussion. Use it to kind of help guide you in that case vignette that's due on Sunday. And once again, we can talk more about this as well on Thursday during our lab. So I'm going to post these slides for you to look at over tonight and the next couple days. Otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call, 715-450-6165, or email me at fosterti, so FOSTERTI, at uwstout.edu, and I can answer as many questions as possible. But thank you for tuning in. Sorry I had to miss class today, but I will be present Thursday to go over any questions you may have. So we'll do more of a lengthy Q&A on Thursday. Other than that, we'll see you then. If you have any questions, give me a call. Talk soon. Thanks.